Welcome everyone to this event about illegal gold mining and international policy priorities at Chatham House, hosted in partnership with the World Gold Council. My name is Reed Levinson. I'm a reporter with Reuters. I've written a bit about artisanal gold mining and the flow of smuggled gold. It's my first time doing this at Chatham House, so please go easy on me. Today, we're going to be examining the global landscape of artisanal gold mining and discuss policy priorities to help address the flow of smuggled gold and how to better formalize this sector. This topic is hugely important to understanding policy and politics today, especially in Africa and the Middle East and in Latin America. The flow of gold mined from small-scale mines has massively expanded in the last 10 years, and so I think this is quite topical. As we'll hear more about today, gold is an ideal way to launder money, and that means it's increasingly being used by bad actors to fund organized crime, conflict, and terrorism. So we'll discuss more about this, and we're going to hear some ways that governments and larger mining companies can help formalize this sector and drive meaningful change. So before we get started, and before I introduce our speakers and our esteemed panelists, I have a few administrative things to go over. So your nearest fire exit in case of emergency is the main Chatham House entrance. Please make sure your cell phones are on silent. We don't want to get interrupted today, so I'll give you guys a moment to do that. Please note that this event is being held on the record, so the usual Chatham House rules will not apply. So that means anyone listening, anyone here today can quote our speakers. And I want to encourage those joining virtually that this event includes them. So please feel free to send in questions or to raise your hand virtually. And I'm told there is a hashtag for those of you still braving Twitter. It's hashtag #CHAfrica. So the event will run until 1 p.m. We have opening remarks, followed by a keynote address, and then a panel discussion with our esteemed panelists. And then we're going to open it up for a Q&A. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have some opening remarks by the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who before becoming president of Chatham House was the Prime Minister of New Zealand and then the first female administrator of the UN Development Programme. And her remarks will be followed by a keynote speech by the Right Honourable Dominic Raab, who is currently the head of global affairs for Appian Capital Advisory and former Deputy Prime Minister, Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor of the UK. He's also a consultant to the World Gold Council and has authored a new report, which is just published today, titled Silence is Golden, about artisanal gold mining and its connection to organized crime and to terrorism, which I'm sure he'll tell you more about today. So first, Helen Clark with some pre-recorded remarks.
Thank you for the invitation to contribute to today's discussion on this important topic. And thank you also to the Right Honourable Dominic Raab and to David Tate and his team at the World Gold Council for their work on this white paper. So let me begin with some comments on the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. First, data on the artisanal and small-scale mining sector is challenging to collect. Best estimates are that there may be 15 to 20 million people engaged in it globally, and it may be the second largest source of rural livelihoods in Africa. Second, up to 1/5 of newly mined gold is now estimated to be produced by artisanal and small-scale miners. That's an increase of 4% from the 1990s. Set against a backdrop of sustained gold price increases over the last 2 years in particular, it's clear that artisanal and small-scale gold mining is an important source of income around the world. Therefore, it should be able to make a meaningful economic contribution in the communities involved in it. Yet, sadly, the reality for those involved in ASM can be very different, with the activities of artisanal mine workers rarely leading to prosperity. The sector sadly is more likely to be associated with environmental degradation, the use of mercury, child labour, and poor, even non-existent, health and safety controls. There's also evidence of a growing contribution of illegal mining to international crime, corruption, and conflict. The United States government, for example, has drawn attention to the role of illegally and artisanally mined gold in funding conflict in the Great Lakes region. This latest report from the World Gold Council is seeking to tackle the challenging ASM landscape by offering ways forward for more international collaboration, which can fight corruption, terrorism, and international crime. That is, to fight those activities which inevitably result in the diversion of revenue away from those who should benefit from the activities. While regulation is needed to address the environmental, health, and safety impacts of ASM, international action is essential to respond to the global networks which are driving corruption, terrorism, and criminal activity. The development of a framework for collective action by the World Gold Council is a very welcome step, complementing other initiatives. There's so much potential for collaboration on this matter with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which I chair. Reporting pursuant to the updated 2023 EITI standard can help provide new data from more than 50 countries, including many with large ASM sectors. Those include Burkina Faso, Colombia, DRC, Ghana, Indonesia, and Mali. The EITI therefore looks forward to working with international stakeholders, including the World Gold Council, to understand how to accelerate data disclosure which can inform good solutions to the challenges ASM faces. It's important that those working in the ASM sector, often among the most vulnerable, can aspire to work in more predictable and safe environments and get greater benefit from their labour and from the resources they are extracting. Addressing the funding of crime, terrorism, and conflict is so vital to promoting this objective and to laying the foundations for a more stable geopolitical and geoeconomic environment for all. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you all a very productive event and discussion.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to turn it over to Dominic Robb to speak about his report. Thank you very much.
Well, can I start by thanking Chatham House for hosting us at this wonderfully prestigious setting, and also need to thank David Tate and the brilliant team at the World Gold Council for having the courage and the determination, frankly, to commission the report that we're launching today. It's entitled Silence is Golden, a report on the exploitation of artisanal gold miners to fund war, terrorism, and organised crime. And also great to have such a terrific, esteemed panel to bounce these ideas off and think about how in practice we can deliver the kind of step change we need to tackle this murky, cruel, and very dangerous trade. Let's start with some basic facts in terms of the gold sector. In 2022, 3.6 thousand tons of gold was mined around the world. So obviously, as the sector was recovering from COVID and those restrictions were being lifted. And in that year, gold was the world's 7th most traded product. So you're talking about a total annual trade of $478 billion US. And that equates the whole gold sector, something like 2% of all total world trade. Now, our focus today, as Helen's very helpfully introduced, is artisanal and small-scale gold mining, which I'll call ASGM just for ease of reference. And it can range. So we can be talking about some poor soul sitting on the side of a riverbank or a hill, going through the mud with a sieve, looking for that gold nugget, which will be the lottery ticket to a better life, to some more rudimentary, but nevertheless starting to look like an industrial type process of some sort. Now, if all that sounds quite crude, and it did to me when I first really got engaged in any depth with this subject, just bear in mind the scale of ASGM. In terms of overall gold production, ASGM accounts for something like 20% of the market. And in terms of trajectory, that's up from 4% in the 1990s. And it employs 20 million people. Now, the vast majority of this kind of work takes place outside any formal legal framework that you would expect in a domestic economy, whether mature or otherwise. So in practice, what we're talking about is artisanal miners often suffering just from the most abject, basic workplace conditions. They range from things like mercury and cyanide poisoning to the pits actually collapsing on them. So very fraught. The corollary of this type of work is also that most ASGM communities are not plugged in to a safe and viable supply chain to sell their gold. So on top of those sort of daily workplace hazards that I mentioned, they are also acting as a honeypot to attract violent exploitation, whether it be from mercenaries, terrorists, drug traffickers, or other criminal groups. And of course, the whole range of domestic legal protections, a whole range of international treaties that ought to offer safeguards and protection. But what is very striking is the conspicuous inertia in enforcing the law, whether it's at the international or the domestic level. So as a result of this, ASGM communities attract some of the most lethal predators. Just to give one illustration, a flavor, if you like, of what we're talking about, for those that perhaps not expert in the field. If you look at the Central African Republic, where the Wagner Group of Russian mercenaries took control of gold mines in return for providing President Touadéra with security services, is actually quite a common model, but it's just one example. That Faustian bargain led to the arbitrary execution of artisanal workers who stood in their way in the town of Kuki. There are accounts of rape and torture in Nadissima, and there were eyewitness accounts of aerial bombardments of Bambari as those mercenaries stood in the way, who seized local mines and effectively pillaged and plundered those who stood in their way. At the same time, over in Latin America, we have criminal gangs perpetrating everything from child labor to sex trafficking to work in the mines and the brothels that often then serve those illegal gold mines. In just one town, Riconada in Peru, 4,500 girls were trafficked for sexual exploitation. It's horrific. In Colombia, the FARC, the Marxist armed group turned drug cartel, has diversified from cocaine and into illegal mining. And that's actually quite a common theme. They extort millions of dollars from poor artisanal miners. They use the gold to launder their profits, which is much easier to smuggle across border. And traceability is a big part of the conundrum that we're trying to address. You look at that as a whole, and that is the tragic story of ASGM communities suffering murder, rape, torture on a horrific scale. It's their piercing reality, if you like, for having the temerity to dream that they might elevate themselves out of poverty and into a better life for themselves and their families. Now, if this humanitarian human rights plight were not enough to move governments and the international community as a whole, then just have a pause for a moment to reflect on who it is that's gaining from this modern day pillage. The Wagner Group and its successor since the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin have earned more than $2.5 billion since the invasion of Ukraine alone. That's funneled back into the Russian war machine. In Sudan, and I know Chatham House are doing a great project on the civil war there, both sides of that conflict, the Sudanese armed forces and the rebel rapid support forces, pillage from the ASGM communities to fund their military efforts, fueling the war and the violence. In the Sahel, offshoots of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State target artisanal gold miners using extortion as part of their wider strategic plan to regroup after the setbacks that they've suffered, including in the Middle East. Just to give you a sense of how real and present that is, in 2022, the UN Counter-Terrorism Committee noted that plundering gold in this way has become, and I quote, an increasingly important source of terrorism financing for global affiliates of ISIL and Al-Qaeda in Africa. In crude terms, it's part of their plan to get back in the terrorism business. And it's happening really beyond the serious focus of the international community. And there are, of course, a wider criminal gangs involved, responsible, and this actually could be a whole piece in of and as of itself, but the environmental degradation through deforestation and pollution. And that's particularly prevalent if you look at Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil. All of these nefarious actors rely on the key international and regional hubs for smuggling and trading their illicit gold, which becomes even then harder to trace. As well as the impact on those ASGM communities at a local or regional level, whole nations are being robbed blind of the profits and the tax revenue being siphoned out of these countries. Again, just to give you one illustrative example, in Sudan, the central bank suggests that in 1 year, it cost Sudan an eye-watering $2 billion. So, the upshot of all of this, from the battlefields of Ukraine, across the terrorist camps of the Sahel, to the drug cartels of Latin America, the illicit profits from this violent abuse of ASGM communities are replenishing, rejuvenating, and ultimately reviving organizations with a very serious track record of aggression, terrorism, and other criminal behavior on a massive scale. And the spread of those illicit networks now presents, I believe, a serious and systemic threat to international peace and security. How do we turn the tide then, before it's too late? What's the practical answer? Well, amidst the range of disparate international efforts to counter one or other symptom of the wider problem, each very well intentioned, but sometimes running in tension, if not cutting across each other, I think the single most important thing that I glean from my study into this area is that a credible and concerted strategic plan will require 4 things. First, we need to target the predators by arresting and prosecuting those responsible for this violence, coupled with a scaled-up drive to disrupt these illicit flows. We must re-inject some element of deterrence. There are roles in all of this for the ICC, the UN, Interpol, the World Customs Organization, but effectively what we need to try and do is work together to deliver much more effective international judicial cooperation to secure the kinds of convictions that can end what is really at the moment fairly blanket impunity. National governments should enact Magnitsky-style sanctions, which are visa bans and asset freezes on the individuals and the businesses involved, so that these dangerous predators cannot move freely. I think that's important, certainly important for them, and also to help choke off their profits. And if you like, that leads to the second pillar, preventing the illicit profiteering. In practice, that requires national governments to implement targeted secondary sanctions against the high-level individuals and the companies involved in the smuggling and the laundering of that illicit gold. And I believe such measures could be reinforced with a renewed drive to implement the OECD's due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains in the gold sector. Now, critically in this, and probably the single most important recommendation I make in this report, is that we need to mandate the Financial Action Task Force to renew its 2015 review into the gold sector with a far more detailed and specific framework that the main international hubs must satisfy if they're going to avoid being placed on the international grey list or indeed the blacklist. Because frankly, it's only through those means that we'll actually choke these enormous profits being made by those willing to trade in human misery. These financial measures, I think, should be buttressed by wider international efforts, and they'll need to be led by the G7 and the G20 to prevent governments in some of those war-torn or fragile states from doing what effectively deals with the devil, hiring mercenaries for protection in return for access to precious natural resources, which are those nation states' birthright. Now, if we're going to achieve that, and I'm really thinking about the foreign policy side of things rather than the sanctions side of things at this point, we'll need to combine diplomacy, development policy, aid funding to deter and to coax those governments who, I think when you look at it for understandable reasons, are vulnerable to such overtures from making those kinds of unconscionable deals. particularly with mercenary groups like the Wagner Group. So, robust, rigorous international law enforcement is a necessary, but it is not a sufficient condition for the effective strategic plan that I have in mind. And we also need to think carefully and sensitively about how to contract, how to shrink the breadth of that large shadow economy, something like 80% of ASGM, which comprises most of those workers and which is such fertile ground for the criminal predators. What does that look like in practice? So that's the third pillar of my report, and it will require the integration of artisanal miners into national legal frameworks so that they can realistically and responsibly trade in the gold market, so that the rule of law can be applied, so that basic standards, we need to be realistic, as I said, can be upheld, whilst at the same time giving artisanal miners and small-scale miners a viable supply chain. That's the way to crowd out the criminal players in this field. I think the blunt, the raw truth is that unless ASGM workers can be elevated up onto some form of formalized platform that allows them to connect, to plug in to a legal and viable supply chain, we can't do that. The threat, the temptation that arises from international criminal gangs cannot and will not be snuffed out. Finally, and clearly there's disparate and diverse elements of this strategy that I'm putting forward. Finally, we need a step change in international coordination to bring all of these diverse strands into a concerted strategy. And that's my final, fourth and final pillar in this report. It requires a recognition from the G7 and the G20 that we now face a systemic security threat from illicit gold flows, and the opportunity, I hope, for an annual discussion at their meetings to focus on implementation, and in particular, this gap between what the law says and what is enforced and implemented on the ground. Of course, we've got the G20 in Rio this week, and I think that's a timely opportunity to call on them to address these threats that we all now face. The OECD, I'm delighted that they're going to be discussing and here to talk through the issue, we believe should also assume a more central role with an expanded mandate to hold a standalone annual ASGM meeting to coordinate all of the diverse organizations and initiatives responsible for implementing the recommendations that we've set out in this report. And finally, the World Gold Council should continue to act, as I know it will, as a champion for the kinds of innovative collaboration that will be necessary if we're going to expand good and best practice and build up those viable supply chain routes to offer those vulnerable miners a route out of exploitation and protection from the mercenaries, terrorists, and gangs that prey on them. I think it's probably clear from what I'm saying that there's no single silver bullet to tackling this challenge. We must put each piece, if you like, of the strategic jigsaw into place if we're going to have the kind of step change in success that we want. If we don't, if inertia wins the day, and that can happen, then I fear we'll condemn millions more to suffer at the hands of these criminal predators. They'll line their pockets with the profits, they'll replenish their ranks, and we should be in no doubt they will do so with the singular objective of striking further blows against both those local artisanal miners and our increasingly fragile international community. But if we can mount a sustained effort on all four fronts with patience and with a measure of staying power, then I'm confident that we can offer responsible artisanal gold miners a path out of poverty and violence and stem the security threats which this awful trade in misery is financing. I just hope we can muster the will to see it through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're now going to have presentations from our panelists, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Ahmed Suleiman, Senior Research Fellow in the Africa Program here at Chatham House, where he focuses on the politics of Somalia, the Sudans, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, and his recent work has examined how gold exacerbates conflict in Ethiopia. Next to him, we have Luca Maiotti. Is that how you pronounce your last name? Thanks. who's a policy analyst focused on responsible mineral supply chains at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. He leads work on corruption and the team's work in Latin America. We have Marcena Hunter, who is joining virtually here. Marcena is the director of Extractives and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, where she's been since 2013. Her work focuses on extractives related to crime, illicit financial flows, and impacts on development. And we have Brad Brooks Rubin, partner at the law firm Arcturus and formerly senior advisor in the Office of Sanctions Coordination at the US State Department, where he worked on Sub-Saharan Africa, Myanmar, and the West Bank. Okay, so if you guys could start with, we'll start with you, Ahmed, and then we'll go down the line. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. So my, unsurprisingly, remarks are going to focus on illicit gold in Africa. And given our work, in particular, looking on a particular project which focuses on cross-border conflict, in particular framing that around transnational conflict, I'll be speaking a little bit about our work, our case study on that, which we'd mentioned on Ethiopia, but also extends into Sudan. And we're currently working on a gold report looking at the transnational political economy of gold in Sudan and how that's connected to conflict. So maybe starting a bit more basically and talking about production, the nature of production on the African continent, also then the mushrooming of illicit gold production on the continent. I think highlighting also the United Arab Emirates as one of the key hubs is what I'm going to talk about. And then, as I said, focusing a bit in on our research on Sudan and some of the emergent findings from there. So as was said at the outset by Helen Clark, I think we have to take gold production statistics themselves with considerable caution, of course. There's very much flawed and variable data collection methods across countries, across regions. Much data isn't public. It simply does not exist as well for many countries too. So it's very much a jigsaw that requires constant working. But I'd like to point to quite an important report by SwissAid on the trail of Africa's gold, which has made a really important attempt to try and quantify some of the production as well as illicit trade flows stemming from gold on the continent. One of the key findings in terms of production is how much production is increasing in Africa. Over a 10-year period between 2012 and 2022, there's a very notable increase in production from 543 tons to around 700 tons. And then since has remained around 650 tons over the last 4 years. So I think the 700 tons was in and around 2018. The largest producers of gold in Africa, Ghana, this is declared gold, I should say, industrial and artisanal, and South Africa. South Africa and Ghana, of course, consistently the largest producers, but they're two fairly stable countries from a governance and security perspective. Now, if you dig a little bit deeper, and amongst the next largest producers, we have Mali, 72 tons in 2022, Burkina Faso at 58, and Sudan at 41.8 tons, all of which have experienced unconstitutional coups in the last 4 years. And of course, we know well and have been discussing how official production figures don't capture that total production. So the non-declared ASGM is significant proportion with respect to what is being declared. In Mali, it's 72 tons versus 57 for non-declared ASGM. Burkina, it's 30 tons, and Sudan, 30 tons. So this shows also that gold sectors, as Dominic was mentioning, are thriving in these authoritarian and unstable contexts. And this brings me on to this mushrooming of illicit gold production and how that connects to one of the hubs. So the SwissAid report suggests that astonishingly every year between 321 and 474 tons of gold are produced on the continent through ASGM without being declared. That's around half of total production, with a commercial value anywhere between $25 and $35 billion. And it represents 3/4 of Africa's total ASGM gold production. When we look at where this gold goes to, the majority of it is exported to only 3 countries: the United Arab Emirates, Switzerland, and India. which makes up 80% of the total ASGM exports. Now, the UAE is one of the main international hubs for gold, as we know, and it's also the biggest destination for traffic gold from Africa. Emirati official statistics show that gold imports from Africa to the UAE more than doubled over this 10-year period between 2012 and 2022, from 243 tons to 609 tons of gold. And this corresponds to a whopping 34.5 billion in 2022 alone, which was almost 60% of the total gold imported to the UAE. If we want to quantify that a different way, my rough mathematics have calculated that accounts for nearly 7% of the UAE's GDP in 2022 alone. And of course, the figures are even more substantial than that. You know, if we're looking at African countries themselves, they have recorded exports to the UAE of only 204 tons in 2022, which leaves an imbalance of 405 tons, which is largely accounted for by smuggling. We get this because the illicit gold is recorded when it enters the UAE officially. So African gold, therefore, is a substantial and significant contributor to the UAE's post-carbon economic and security horizon. It's why African states such as Sudan increasingly form part of these and other states' second-tier relationships and interests with the UAE. They're integral to the country's kind of vision for an economic transport corridor from East Africa across the Sahel into West Africa. And it's really intersecting with the UAE's emergence as a middle-order power, and what we're seeing more so in the kind of geopolitical and geostrategic fields, it's contestation with the Saudis for economic diversification. Now touching a bit on Sudan and how its gold connects to transnational conflict. I would argue that gold has been a triggering factor in two of the largest acts of mass violence at the national level in Sudan's recent history. First, the coup that we saw in October 2021, and now the ongoing devastating war we've been experiencing since April 2023, which is fragmenting the country. The gold is Sudan's most valuable commodity, its chief exports, its main source of foreign currency, particularly since the oil sector contracted after South Sudan's secession in 2011. It's also the main resource for the conflict parties, the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Forces. What we see is that with the fragmentation of the war in Sudan, and SAF and RSF reinforcing control over gold-producing areas, they're kind of reinforcing control over separate areas in order to consolidate their power. SAF has control over the north and east of Sudan, where most of Sudan's commercial mines are, while the RSF has control over most of the mining in the Western Darfur region. Gold production declined initially, as our research is suggesting when the war began, but has since very much bounced back. And particularly in army-controlled areas, it is booming again. So I think the kind of official statistics have jumped to 29.2 tons, valued at over 1.86 billion in 2024, with the belief also that could double by the end of the year with the resumption of mining activities by concession companies. Yeah.
Yvonne, do you want to have a couple of final thoughts?
Oh yeah, I'll just wrap up. Thank you. So as I said, the majority of this gold is ending up in the United Arab Emirates, either directly or via transit country. And I can kind of come to recommendations when we come into the questions, but just to say that gold is a crucial component within this extensive and evolving transnational war economy, which is perpetuating violence and political instability. It's being smuggled not only to the United Arab Emirates, but to Egypt, through other transit countries such as Chad, Eritrea, and South Sudan, onto Uganda. And this network includes, groups of armed actors, traders, smugglers, and business people. It's being used to procure arms from China, Iran, Russia, and Turkey, the UAE, and elsewhere. And this means that among their other interests, countries, including the UAE, Egypt, and others, have a direct economic interest in the outcome of the war in Sudan. And we can come back to the recommendations maybe a bit later, but I would suggest that if we're trying to solve conflicts, including such as the one in Sudan, we have to think very carefully about those economic interests and include them in any political settlements moving forward. They have to be transnational in nature. They have to include those economic interests. Thank you.
Luca?
Thanks. Thanks, Chatham House, for the invitation. My team works on the promotion and implementation of the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible mineral supply chains, which is a government-backed standard for companies that expects them to identify and address adverse impacts in their mineral supply chains, such as human rights abuses, conflict financing, and other financial crimes, such as corruption, money laundering, and tax evasion. The guidance applies to all actors along the mineral supply chain, so companies in the mining, trading, transporting, refining, manufacturing stage, they have to carry out due diligence. And this also applies to ASM, artisanal and small-scale mining. In particular, the guidance has a specific annex with provisions with suggested measures to facilitate the formalization and legalization of artisanal and small-scale mining. And in general, the work of the team really focuses on ensuring that these requirements for ASM are applied in a progressive way. So in order to include legitimate actors rather than exclude them. Today, I want to make 3 points. First, we often hear we have an issue with artisanal and small-scale mining, but I think it is more appropriate to say we have an issue with artisanal and small-scale mining supply chains. In many countries, exporters, aggregators, local buyers are the ones, so not only provide an avenue for sometimes illegally extracted gold to access international markets, but they often provide pre-financing, transport, chemicals, machinery, so all the infrastructures that miners need, but they cannot find through formal sources. And this trading, exporting segment of the supply chain for me is really key because it's at this stage that various gold sources, including illegally mined gold, can be aggregated or mixed into those small bars that are called doré with 70 to 90% purity that are then exported to international markets, sometimes illegally. And this blending at the processing stage is not only important because it limits the physical traceability of the gold to the sources, but when it's smuggled and happens, when the gold is smuggled and sometimes the processing happens in a different country, that country becomes the legal origin of the gold. So in customs data, you will see that where the processing has taken place as the origin of the gold. So when thinking about taxation, incentives for formalization, we need to think in terms of supply chains, upstream supply chains. This brings me to my second point, which is when it comes to solutions, we often hear traceability a lot. And if we rely on paper traceability alone, some companies may state rightfully that the origin of their gold is Switzerland or the UAE, two countries that paradoxically have no mines, but are two major gold trading hubs. So we first have to be clear on what traceability can and cannot do, and ensure that the focus on traceability does not replace the focus on due diligence. So traceability is a means to an end. It's a tool that provides the transparency over the supply chain upon which companies need to act by identifying, mitigating, communicating, and preventing adverse impacts. Also, when talking about traceability, full end-to-end traceability might not even be feasible for ASM because we need to consider things such as barriers to access in terms of costs, in terms of technology for ASM communities that are sometimes or mostly living in rural areas. The issue of interoperability between different traceability standards that are often provided by private sector And third, the intrinsic limitations of traceability systems when it comes, for example, to verifiability of the information that we put into the traceability system. So what do we do? That's my third point. The good news is, and the report lays out really well, we don't start from scratch. We don't start from zero. And I'd like to focus on two international instruments or processes that Dominic mentioned. The first one is the Financial Action Task Force, which is the standard setter for anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. Under FATF, Financial Action Task Force standards, dealers of precious metals and stones are obliged entities. This means that they have to carry out customer due diligence, they have to file suspicion transaction reports, but there is a caveat. Only when there are cash transactions beyond 15,000 euros. So, of course, this is a limitation, but FATF, as a very thorough review mechanism of country supervisions, of companies' awareness and implementation of anti-money laundering standards, that should be leveraged. And they've just started the 6th round of mutual evaluations. And of course, we know that goal-based money laundering schemes are very difficult to catch through FATF standards alone, but mutual evaluation reviews can really raise the profile of gold, of the gold sector, really at the highest level. So for policymakers in the room, let's work together. It'd be great to see more political support for the FATF Secretariat to have a look at gold, as also outlined in the report. The second and last instrument is the OECD due diligence guidance implementation process. This guidance was born as a non-mandatory instrument, but we call it soft law with hard consequences. It has been introduced, integrated into legal framework of importing, processing, and producing countries. There are industry associations such as the London Bullion Market Association that require members to pass an audit according to the OECD guidance in order to sell on the exchange. And of course, this regulatory architecture is not perfect. We wouldn't be having this conversation today. But we know that gold is challenging, and we need to, use all the help we can have and improve it. So how do we improve it? With more and better due diligence. More because not all countries are supporting the implementation of the due diligence guidance, so we don't have a level playing field. And better due diligence because for many companies, due diligence is still just a tick-the-box exercise. So I'm happy to expand on those two recommendations, but thanks for the attention.
Now we'll go to Marcena, who is joining us virtually.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you to Chatham House and the World Gold Council. I think this report is a great initiative by the WGC, and I welcome how it's highlighting the really significant global threat that the gold sector is playing. So I want to make a few points here. I think the first is that we need to change our perceptions around what artisanal and small-scale gold mining is, or ASGM. And I think Luca set the stage for this really well, talking about changing it to looking at supply chains from ASGM. What we're seeing on a global scale is that operations are becoming larger and more sophisticated, and they're using more major machine operations, more advanced technology. And when you see these operations, the question becomes, are these really artisanal and small scale, or are we moving into medium scale? The other thing we're seeing is that criminal operators are not actually engaging in mining. We're often seeing them engaging in like the processing, for example, cyanide leaching or gold concentrate, or even just the renting of equipment to miners or controlling the land. And so they have different roles in the gold sector than just mining. And also the mining itself is not small anymore. It's really significant. And then also a lot of criminality we see in the sector comes to abuse of power, which includes extortion and corruption. And so illegal mining, what we see is just the tip of the iceberg and often the most vulnerable in these systems, which I think has been highlighted well. And so illicit financial flows are often a form of extortion, for example, taxing miners that can take different forms. and abuse of power, so land grabbing, corruption. We also see the gold sector playing a significant role in funding political campaigns in multiple countries. And so I think this also needs to warrant the question of just because a mining operation is perhaps legal on paper or has a concession, is there not criminality involved? And I think this goes to maybe the aspect around due diligence, is that if we apply these checkbox approaches to this, we're missing really big aspects of criminality in this sector, and how we're seeing criminality really consolidated into the hands of more and more powerful groups, whether they're politicians, organized crime groups, private military companies. And this doesn't look like ASGM anymore. And so I think we need to change our perspectives around what criminality actually is. A couple other factors shaping criminality in the sector are certainly geopolitics. For example, in West Africa, we see Mali and Niger changing dynamics there with ECOWAS and international partners, as has been highlighted. But this is something that we're seeing globally with geopolitics and foreign direct investment shaping business relationships and perhaps enforcement or mining contracts in multiple countries, which also goes to both large scale mining. And again, that checkbox exercise of like, what does criminality actually look like in the sector versus ASGM? And then just to say, I don't think we can understate how attractive the gold sector is to criminal actors. Gold is more profitable than cocaine and drug markets. And we see this in, for example, South America. I know FARC was brought up, but major Brazilian organizations like PCC, CV, other countries, organized crime groups are moving into gold. It's incredibly profitable. It's much lower risk. And also gold is a monetary vehicle that can be used to launder money. And you don't even have to move gold to launder money. And so how attractive gold is on multiple levels, whether it's to generate profits, to launder funds, to evade sanctions, it really is a driving factor there. And so with this becomes really sophisticated, dynamic criminal networks. These are not basic or simple networks or actors that we're dealing with. These are complex networks with highly sophisticated methods in place. And this requires similarly sophisticated responses, which I think is a great call from the report, saying that this requires investment, that this requires attention, and to be seen as an international security threat. And so I think building on what Luca said as well, what is like a really big challenge here is the challenge of the midstream. So we have the mine sites that are visible and we can see them. And there's been a significant amount of development work, lots of NGOs, governments working like at the mine site. And then we also have increased due diligence or traceability efforts or standards at the downstream on refiners or consumers. But we've got this really big chunk of activity and actors in the middle, which was referred to. So we've got processors, aggregators, exporters, that sort of thing. And these are really critical actors in enabling and profiting from criminality, but they're also really difficult to reach because they're often situated in countries where maybe we don't have jurisdiction or powerful law enforcement. And they're often heavily protected by either local authorities, national authorities. They may not have assets in foreign countries that could be sanctioned or that sort of thing. And so this is a really challenging, I think, group or aspect of the supply chain to tackle. And this is why the investment into research and investigations, which really shed a light on how they operate, is so important to help us identify those pressure points and design policies that can tackle and have an impact on those most difficult to reach actors and points on the supply chain. So I would just like to finish with I think perhaps a word of warning that we can't lose sight of our end goals. There's been a lot of talk about development, and that's certainly something that's close to my heart around actually benefiting the communities and the people who are most negatively impacted by this. And I think Luca made a great point that traceability, we need to be clear on what traceability can and cannot do. It is a tool. And so while traceability and due diligence is a really essential step and needs to be part of our responses, it doesn't on its own necessarily deliver development gains to communities or those upstream actors. In fact, often villages where illegal mining is happening have really strong development gains. They're the villages that have the metal roofs or the motorbikes or that sort of thing. And so if we're looking at development gains for communities, we need to find that balance. And also that and help make ASGM and those communities more resilient, because resilient communities are much more stronger to organized crime. And then finally, removing criminality doesn't necessarily deliver development gains. And what I mean here is that establishing responsible supply chains, if what we're doing is simply legalizing bad actors, or bringing them into formal supply chains rather than changing the system itself, that's not going to deliver development gains. It's simply shifting one set of actors into the formal sector, I guess you could say. And so we do need holistic responses which take all of this together, as the report said, greater investment and efforts which I think really make the ASGM sector and communities more resilient.
Thanks very much, Marcena. And lastly, Brad.
Good. Thanks so much. It's hard to follow all of this excellent content. First, congratulations to you on an excellent report and the World Gold Council, and thanks to Chatham House for having me as well. I guess to some degree, I'll try to finish by kind of completing a somewhat unplanned arc, I guess, of the way our remarks have worked, and talk more about finishing the sort of midstream and downstream of the supply chain, and the idea that all this gold is still going somewhere. And I think we need to continue to make sure we're focusing on that. This report is an excellent, I think, encapsulation and crystallization of, frankly, what are more than 20 years of actions and frameworks and reports and typologies and assessing this issue. And it's time that we really get a sense of whether the underlying system of the global gold supply chain can fundamentally adapt to eliminate these now very well-known and understood risks. And until we shift from, as others have said, from this focus on assessment and due diligence to very pointed and specific questions about corporate decision-making and response to those risks, and encourage companies to be sharing data publicly and also with governments on those risks, I fear we will continue to move in circles more than lines. I'm going to make 3 quick kind of overarching points and then hopefully 3 quick recommendations. On the upstream side, I do think we somewhat do ourselves, there's probably no other way to do it, but a bit of a disservice by thinking about ASGM as kind of a single issue or a single problem. The report really does an excellent job of capturing that every mine site, every community, every country is different and is facing different contexts, different issues, and different challenges. And because of all the work that's been done, we actually have frameworks. We have approaches for most of those issues, for what those interventions can be. We know how to do a lot of this work. And so, as was noted with G20, G7, now what we need is a lot of will, a lot of funding, a lot of patience, and persistence in the face of challenges and backward steps. But I think the more we continue to sort of define ASGM generally, we're trying to solve for too much with one problem and one concept. Second, on sanctions and law enforcement, as a very long-time sanctions geek, proudly wearing that title, I'm glad the report focuses so much on sanctions and prosecutions. But a couple of kind of reflections from a lot of experience on this in and out of government. First is, comparatively, gold has been the subject of an extraordinary number of sanctions actions already, whether it's the Wagner Group Congo, Sudan, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia. There are hundreds and hundreds of sanctions actions that have been taken in addition to prosecutions. There can always be more. But sadly, as I think Marcena somewhat explained, and the report does as well, we still live in a world where there are bad guys, there is likely gold. And sanctions and prosecutions are in the end tools of disruption more than change. They disrupt and they impact specific individuals for our companies, sometimes just for a very short time. But I don't know that these actions will necessarily change the sector. And to me, the question is more not so much whether what the impact is on those bad guys and getting those bad guys out, but how do the good guys respond, take note of these kinds of actions, and respond and adjust to their behavior. And another point on sanctions is just that resources in governments are always constrained in these kinds of areas, especially in a world that is focusing a lot more on critical minerals and the energy transition, sadly, than gold right now. Not sadly, but for this conversation, maybe sadly. And I think we have to recognize that industry often has a lot more actionable data on bad actors than governments do. And I'll get to this in my recommendations, unless there is more way to bring information on bad actors from industry to governments, I think we will see fewer actions rather than less. I would note that may change if the future Trump administration starts to assess the role of China in this more directly and maybe honestly. And so third, on the midstream and downstream, as Marcena tried to put in or started to note, that is really where I think we can focus. High risk and even criminally connected ASGM simply couldn't move in the way it does and with the kinds of profits it has if there wasn't an ultimate end source for it. So until those consolidators, processors, refineries, and the jewelry sector, the banking sector, the tech sector that then consumes that gold are willing to fundamentally change the system through which the supply chain works, we will continue to sort of point at the problem maybe more than fixing it. In response to all these reports, and in response, I hope, to this report as well, how many refineries or downstream producers have really changed the way they source gold and eliminated suppliers and refineries in their supply chains? And similarly important, invested upstream in the kind of work that the LBMA is now doing in trying to bring artisanally mined gold into refineries, as well as to development programs. How many of the auditors in this sector are asking focused and specific questions about the risks that are in this report and in the many reports before them when they are visiting companies and actually holding companies' feet to the fire about how they have changed their decision-making, about how they engage, especially for companies that deal with recycled gold? And how is the supply chain now adjusting to the action and information that we've learned recently from the UAE? And I appreciate the report notes the FATF. The UAE was gray-listed in 2022, and we've now seen the UAE suspend more than 30 refineries and recently note that because of the regulatory changes they made, suspicious transaction reporting in the UAE went from 200 or so in 2021 to more than 6,000 in 2023. So are downstream companies taking note of that and similarly assessing their own risks? Are other centers doing these same kinds of mechanisms to require more suspicious transaction reporting? Again, if we're just doing suspicious transaction reporting, we're pointing at the problem. We're not necessarily changing it. And that's really where we need to come into, we need to see things start to shift. Just quickly on recommendations. One, transparency, we really needs to go from a nice to have to a must. That can look differently in different places, but the more transparent the supply chain, it's true that transparency isn't in itself, or traceability isn't an end, but decision-making can only rest with information. Two, the report prompted me to kind of think of the idea of the UK has this mechanism called JMLIT, the Joint Money Laundering Investigation Task Force, where banks work with the government to share data that they have to allow banks to work together in ways that they're not normally allowed to, and with the government on information, because normally banks are only seeing a piece of a criminal puzzle. It's the same for the gold supply chain. So in the US, we have something called FinCEN Exchange. let's see the gold sector, let's work for governments and the industry to come together to create a GIMLET or a FinCEN exchange focused on gold, to allow gold companies to share information that they have and then receive information from governments to allow them to take real action. That's I think, a specific thing that can be done. And then 3, again, let's focus on corporate decision-making to understand how companies can engage upstream, as well as to be clear about the ways that they're changing their supply chain practices in response to risk. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to open it up to Q&A. If you could say your name and affiliation when you ask a question, and also if you want to direct it at a specific speaker, please say. First hand.
Thank you so much, Chatham House and the speakers, amazing panel. My name is Andres from the London School of Economics. My question is there enough goal to support the energetic transition in every single country? Enough goal. Thank you. It's clear, the question?
Yes, I think so. Is there enough gold to support
The energetic transition in all the countries? Energetic transition, you need, because we are developing a lot of green projects across the world in developing countries. We are going to more green economy, and we need minerals and gold to support that energetic transition. My question is if there is enough gold for that, because it's a global goals.
I want to tackle that one.
Look, I think there's gold is an important part of the green transition, not as much as copper, nickel, lithium, and those other things. There's a lot of lithium in the world. The question, and it's a slightly different one for critical minerals, is there a viable, safe supply chain? I think the truth is the level of concentration in the critical minerals sector is far higher than in gold. You've got, if you take some of them, they're 95% plus concentration, which is high compared to gold or oil and gas. So I think the challenge with critical minerals and the green transition is slightly different from this. But is there enough gold? Yeah, I don't think the problem is volume. That's my understanding, my appreciation.
Do we have another question over here?
Thank you very much, and congratulations to all the presenters. Kenneth Sullivan, formerly International Monetary Fund, now working with the World Gold Council. I've had previous experience in the field with gold mining in Zimbabwe and Myanmar, so I understand the issues a bit. But my question is a positive one. Not all governments are compromised in the ASGM field. There are a number of governments who are taking actions against illegal mining and are coming into possession with illegally acquired gold. And I would really appreciate the panel's thoughts about what actions and what risks and processes central governments should follow in processing and disposing of gold seized under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Thank you very much.
Interesting question. Brad, do you want to take a stab?
Well, it is a good question, and I'll admit not one I've given enough thought to. I mean, I think the concept of that governments play and that central banks play in gold buying has the World Gold Council has done remarkably good work on that, and trying to bring central banks together around that. I think in the question of what happens with seizure of illegal gold, there's a lot of discussion in sort of general sanctions world about what you do with assets, and I think a lot of it just comes down to, one, being transparent about it and being clear what decisions governments are making, and two, to ensure as much as possible that the benefits of the sale of that gold gets back to the communities that were perhaps harmed in the first place. And that has looked in the sort of sanctions and seized assets world in lots of different ways, sometimes back to national governments, sometimes to development programs, sometimes the creation of funds that communities can then draw on later. So I think there are probably a lot of different approaches that could be taken, but I think the most important one is that the decision-making about it be perhaps transparent, but also collectively engaged in, so that, again, what that looks like in Myanmar versus what that looks like in Zimbabwe, probably pretty different at the moment in both places. And I think allowing the development of best practices around that, but ultimately to ensure that the money can get back to the communities that were harmed as much as possible would be my gut instinct on it anyway.
We have
Others
two
thoughts?
questions virtually that I thought I'd bring up really quickly. So one is about Tigray, Ethiopia, and to what extent gold and the gold trade has exacerbated the conflict there, which Ahmed, I thought you could speak to. And we have another about ASGM related criminality in parts of Peru that are avoided by refineries and certification bodies, and to what extent that is exacerbating the conflict, particularly with indigenous communities, which I thought maybe, Luca, you could take a stab at.
Yeah, sure. On Ethiopia, it's really interesting because, of course, we've had another really detrimental and devastating conflict in Tigray over 2 years. Many people would say that war is not really ended, despite the Pretoria Peace Agreement in being signed in 2022 and various stages of implementation of that peace agreement, but that not really being a holistic peace agreement. What we've seen is the emergence of an interim administration that at this point in time is very divided and factionalized into two main factions. And our understanding is that part of the interests around that are economic, around who controls the levers for reconstruction in Tigray, who controls the resources, and to make ends meet, a lot of people have within certainly northeast and north central parts of Tigray have resorted to mining. This is being controlled by the security sector to a large part, the Tigrayan Defence Forces, and certain elements, certain generals within that. And also that gold is being smuggled. It's not in any way being captured and being kind of appropriated within the central budget. It's not being used for, as I said, for the necessary reconstruction of the region. When we talk of up to 2 million people being displaced during the war there, the needs are huge humanitarian needs in Tigray, and that resource is being leveraged for a very few actors, political security actors, and their interests. When you have such desperation and the potential for conflict to reignite in Tigray, it's a travesty, really. And I think gold is increasingly a part of that. And we talk about the supply chains. The gold is being exported, both through the center, both through Ethiopia, out through Somaliland, and also we hear through Eritrea. And one of the avenues that made that possible is the war, because that opened up an illicit channel of trade between parts of Amhara-controlled Western Tigray and Eritrea. So again, it's another example of where we see a valuable resource that's being extracted, but not for the benefit of local people, and certainly in who have extremely great need at this moment in time.
And yeah, on Peru, I mean, of course, impacts on indigenous people is just one of the adverse impacts that are present. They're linked to illegal mining. Human trafficking is another one, especially from Brazil. Threats to environmental defenders, deforestation. Anecdotally, when flying, for example, to Puerto Maldonado in the Madre de Dios region, you could actually see the forest coverage looks like lungs eaten by cancer because of the deforestation patches due to illegal mining. And at the same time, it, I think, shows very well how the earlier point about the midstream, the legal production of ASM in that region, for example, cannot travel by plane, so it makes it economically very difficult to be exported legally. The local traders will not accept any gold that is not been processed with mercury. So we've got the sort of reverse incentives. But more generally, Peru has had a temporary formalization process that was opened in 2002 and is still active. And actually, there is now a law being discussed to continue this formalization, which so basically allows any miner that is basically in this register for formalization to legally export it, even though there are very few checks. And at the same time, the company trading system in the country has very little checks. So at this, we're seeing different levels of scrutiny when it comes to different types of actors in the supply chain.
Yeah.
Can I just make one quick?
Please.
I mean, I think this last couple of questions just bring up, maybe highlight a point. On Ethiopia and on the question related to Myanmar, I think in contrast with, say, Sudan and Peru, which are much larger producers and sort of rightly so, get a lot of attention in different ways. I think one of the reasons that I would focus on decision-making, things like transparency, traceability, all of these things are important because there are very serious risks related to gold and its connection to Ethiopia and Myanmar, even if they're small producers. I mean, the US government did an advisory about Myanmar and mentioned gold, among other things, earlier in the year. So unless we are getting more granular about how decisions are made, it's hard to get much attention for sort of the risks that fly below the top 4 or 5. Because if we're thinking about risk-based due diligence, then you tend to only look at the top 5 or 10 producers and say, all right, what are the risks related to those? And everything else gets sort of lost in the shuffle. And there are, as a result, millions of people who are affected by we don't have enough time or energy or way to look at whether or not. I would be surprised if many people in the gold industry have given an ounce of thought, no pun intended, to Ethiopia. And that's unfortunate. And I think hopefully a report like this and discussions like this can help kind of reframe how people think about those subjects.
Do we have any more questions here? Wow, okay. Should we do 3 at a time and see if we can sort of combine some? Yeah, over there.
Thank you. My name's Timothy Fularanmi. I'm a lawyer at a city law firm, but I previously worked at 2 of the major criminal and regulatory enforcement agencies here in the UK who would deal with some of the matters that we have discussed today. And it seems to me that when it comes to enforcement, there is a will by many of these agencies to enforce, but actually it's a problem of resourcing, i.e. they simply don't have enough of a budget to enforce at the level they would wish to. And so my question is for all of the panel. What appetite do you think there is amongst governments, particularly I would say Western governments, to properly sort of resource some of these agencies that are tasked with carrying out investigations and prosecuting these sort of matters? And secondly, with that as well, is that the start point for many of the supply chains that we've discussed here reside in developing countries. And many of these countries have a suspicion sometimes of outside forces, outside governments interfering in their domestic affairs. And so in what ways can Western countries, for example, work more collaboratively with some of these countries to obviously sort of end these issues? Thank you.
Thank you. Should we take 2 more questions and then sort out in the back over there?
Hello, Glenn Promnitz from the Sudan and South Sudan All-Party Parliamentary Group. As previously discussed, Sudan is now the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, and it is getting worse and worse. And as said, the gold industry is absolutely fundamental in this conflict. And further, that the gold industry wider is fundamental in the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. What is to be done about it? It is getting worse, and the fighting is only continuing because of the gold industry and it funding that. And obviously this is, to most people, unacceptable. So what steps are to be taken next in regards to this?
Thank you. We take a question up here in the front in white, gray.
Thank you. My name is Naziru from the University of Westminster. My question is, if you look at the geopolitics in West Africa, where Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, they're all moving in one direction, and they're very critical to the security of the entire region. What do you think countries like Nigeria and Ghana needs to do, for example, to tackle this issue? Because only last month there was a report of the emergence of a new terror group in Nigeria, in Northwest. And this report said they move around from Mali to Burkina Faso to Niger and to Nigeria, and they're operating freely there. And gold, we know, is playing a role in influencing this crisis. What do you think countries like Nigeria need to do to tackle this? Thank you.
Wow, three very different questions here. Should we start with Sudan and the role of gold and what we can do about that?
Sure, thank you, Glenn. It's a huge question, an important one. I think, of course, the nature of how gold is sustaining the war in Sudan is an important in itself in thinking about how we should end the war. And I think it was one of the things that was hurriedly saying towards the end. I think that it's important to understand the nature of Sudan's evolving war economy, for there to be more research and support for organizations that are working to uncover the networks that are funding and supporting and sustaining the war. So I think that is an important area that needs support at this moment in time. I think this combination, and a couple of people have pointed to it themselves, of engaging more on a political, on a kind of political strategy. What is the emphasis? How do we get more emphasis on leverage to end the war in Sudan, and leverage through those regional parties that are supporting the warring parties in Sudan? Because I don't think that the leverage necessarily on the warring parties, aside from what Brad mentioned, which is you're not really going to change the networks. You can disrupt them, and I think disrupting them is important. Understanding them and disrupting them is important, but that needs to go alongside a political strategy, and a more coherent one. What we see at the moment is a lack of a coherent political strategy for ending the war in Sudan, certainly a lack of a coordinated one. And in my view, in order to have a more coordinated strategy, we not only need to think about it transnationally, of course, bringing in the regional actors and bringing in the international community as well, but we need to think about what are the ways out of the war. How do we satisfy some of the economic interests that are at stake at the war, within this war? And gold, as you say, is a key part of that. So understanding that and trying to find solutions towards engaging it more transparently, more openly, I think will be an important part of trying to end the war. Not necessarily saying you can force the two parties to the table for a ceasefire as a result of that, but you need to be able to target the interests of those who are actively engaged in sustaining this war.
Does anyone else want to jump in on Sudan? Yeah.
I don't know if I'll maybe say two words. One of them is to give, since you also mentioned South Sudan, which is below the radar at the moment, sadly, because of how difficult everything in its neighborhood is. But maybe she'll talk about it. I'll give a shout out to Marcena, who's done some of the best work on gold in South Sudan and the role that South Sudan plays in the gold trade, including some of the flows from Sudan. And so I think that's a piece of the puzzle. I would just point to a couple of things. I mean, I would agree with Ahmed. I think this is a place where more sanctions could be helpful. But I think, for example, if you look, it's known from trade data that all of that gold goes to the UAE. So, engaging the UAE government to perhaps identify Sudan as a conflict-affected and high-risk area, so that the due diligence that its refineries are doing has to be enhanced. And again, with the information, I would assume that of that 30-fold increase of suspicious transaction reports that gold refineries in UAE have filed, I would guess. I mean, we don't know. So one, it would be nice to know transparently where that data is, although that's not something that most governments publish. But that's the kind of thing that further downstream refineries in Switzerland and consumers of anything coming out of the UAE should be asking what the connection of Sudan is, and to have that push, not just from the government side, which is important, but from the downstream to ask about any gold coming out of the UAE, whether it is connected to Sudan, including from recycled gold, would be the kind of pressure that, again, could help to disrupt things. The solution to the problem in Sudan is a very challenging one that's way beyond me, but I think it's important that we kind of keep it on the mind and the radar of the sector itself.
Marcena, do you want to jump in on South Sudan?
Yes, Brad's right. I do have thoughts. On the UAE, I think we need to stop treating like the UAE as a passive actor in Africa and having their gold going to the UAE. There's growing evidence that the UAE is directly involved in Sudan and has been arming RSF. They are investing in the conflict. And so this isn't just a passive gold flow that's going to the UAE. Like, they are active actors in multiple African theaters. And so we need to also think about geopolitics here, because there is no shortage of data or investigations or evidence for many years that the UAE that illicit flows have been going to the UAE. But the Middle East is messy at the moment, to say the least. And the UAE has been seen as a strong ally by multiple countries. And so I think this report, and drawing attention to the fact of illicit gold flows and the sector and illicit financial flows more broadly, really, and the destabilizing effect they're having around the world, and weighing up that versus maybe other political priorities, and really understanding like the true impact on stability and violence globally is really important. As Brad said with South Sudan, with oil, gold really did flow or go beneath the radar. There has been a renewed interest in it recently, and I expect we'll see many articles and reports coming out soon around South Sudan. But what we did see with that is that while prominent actors were at the table negotiating peace settlements, proxy groups or other groups were actually fighting over gold fields or deposits in rural locations, or even sometimes they were working next to each other with some sort of peace agreement or understanding. And so I think one of the first points made by Ahmed was about how gold and extractives more generally really need to be a bigger part of peace negotiations and the economics of this, because that's truly what we're seeing driving conflict outside of the negotiation tables. And while I do have the microphone, I wanted to touch on the point around West Africa and Nigeria and Ghana. Certainly in northern Nigeria, the overlap between gold mining and banditry and violence is a really increasing concern. But going back to my point of resilient communities, this is one of the best ways where we can help to prevent criminal exploitation and the capture of these markets, is by helping communities become more resilient. And so this requires investment, transparency, addressing corruption at all levels, everywhere from petty corruption to grand corruption, because these are the things that undermine and make communities weak and then very vulnerable to that exploitation when criminal groups come in. And I think that's something that we can see. It's difficult. It's not easy, as Nigeria has long experience in. But these are ways where we can really, I think, take some first steps to preventing that capture of the sector.
Thank you so much. There's a question in the chat that I wanted to read out about what basis was the UAE removed from the FATF's gray list, from Peter Leon, who says, my understanding it was under pressure from the US Treasury. Does anyone want to tackle that one?
Look at the time. Well, first, I mean, maybe while we're noting Treasury, there was the question about resources, and I think Treasury, you know, has actually devoted quite a lot in the U.S. to these issues. I also want to give a shout out to the Homeland Security investigations, part of the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S., which has just set up a wildlife and environmental crimes unit, which is devoting a lot of resources to gold work. And there are great people in the UK government. Some of them are here who've done really good work on Russia alerts and other things. So there's a lot of good work happening. And yes, I made a brief note of how much attention is actually now shifting. The first question we got was about the energy transition. In terms of resources, and sadly, budgets tend to flow where interest is. And I would say a lot of budgets and interest in legislation in the US anyway is flowing towards that and away. And it's harder and harder to get people to work on gold issues, as I found in my time back at the State Department. It was hard to get people around the table to focus on gold. I don't think it's an accurate assessment to say that the UAE removal was part of US pressure. I mean, it wasn't a part of those discussions, but I think the one reason that FATF has maintained such credibility, and I think it's really well noted in the report, is because it's actually been fairly immune from those kinds of political dynamics in a way that other initiatives have. There's a very technical process. The FATF evaluation, gold was one very tiny piece of a much bigger puzzle that the UAE had to come forward on. And my understanding was that they met the criteria. So there may be more to it than that, but I think it's an important piece of what FATF is at this point, is that it shields itself from that. I don't know if you.
Yeah, well, let's on that. Just the other question about law enforcement from the gentleman that had the experience. The first thing, absolutely, we do need to invest more in it, whether it's at national level. I talk in the report a little bit about it, regional level. But also, I was having pen envy of Brad's World Customs Organization pen here. But if you look at the work the WCO does, it prompted me to think that we should give a shout out to the WCO. It does really good work in terms of that disruption element. And disrupting all businesses, even legal businesses, like certainty. And if you can disrupt what they're doing, makes life more expensive. So the amount of investment in the WCO all coming from the State Department. I think the project funding all came from the State Department over the last 5 years. And yet still in the round is too small. That is something where a relatively modest amount of extra investment would yield a massive gain. And if anyone, I think people become a bit skeptical about old-fashioned law enforcement. And I remember talking to Marcena about the report as I was working on it, and many others. We do need to do these two things in tandem, but do not forget the law enforcement piece. And one of the most fascinating things is how the drug traffickers have gone into gold because it's so expensive to traffic cocaine now. Now, you don't want to have what I would call the whack-a-mole syndrome, where you clamp down in one area and it reappears in another, and which is why you need to have a holistic strategy. But law enforcement makes life much more difficult for the bad actors, and they either you'll disincentivize what they're doing, which is important because you contract the area in which they can operate. That's important, or you shift them out of your sector. Now, we don't just want to push the problem somewhere else, but actually it does also mean robust, consistent law enforcement makes it much more difficult, and therefore you'll shrink, if you like, the problem in aggregate terms, as well as pushing it into other more vulnerable areas. And drug trafficking is a very good example where for many years, I think a lot of development commentators criticized the US-led war on drugs. It's had a massive impact. You can see it, and unfortunately in the gold sector, you can see it because people those same groups are moving into those areas where there's a confluence of cocaine and gold.
That is a great point to end on. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you all for attending, and thanks very much to our panelists and speakers today.